This episode, I'm joined once again by author, researcher, and futurist Kingsley Dennis. He is the author of multiple books on modernity, control, and esotericism, and in this episode we discuss his latest book, The Modern Seeker, a Perennial Psychology for Contemporary Times, alongside discussions on ancient wisdom, rebellion, George Gurdjieff, technology, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers, making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix podcast, or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So, Kingsley Dennis, thanks very much for joining us once again on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing your latest book, The Modern Seeker, a Perennial Psychology for Contemporary Times. This is a book, as many would imagine from that title, about perennial psychology and, in a certain sense, perennial philosophy, which I think is It's been left by the wayside, the idea of a sort of an overarching, ancient potential towards truth. Thanks for coming on. So why did you decide to write this book? And how would you describe it?
Well, James, I decided to write it because it's always been a personal interest of mine, this type of philosophy. So throughout my adult life, I've been researching and involving myself in this type of knowledge, let's say. But it was mostly a personal project that was, a part of my own interests, and I haven't before written so directly about it. This type of subject has always infused my work, let's say, more indirectly, and a lot of the authors that come up in that book have been in some way or other kind of influencing what I write. But I came to a time where I thought, well, let's make this personal project into an actual publication. Also gave me time to, focus on what I considered to be around this subject. And it was a book that I didn't write straight away. I came on and off it, as you say, more of a personal project between other ones. And then I sat down and it came out, and I think it was, appropriate to these times. If you ask me what I consider to be this perennial philosophy / psychology, it's that, well, from the beginnings of I suppose early civilization, there's always been the understanding that there's a wisdom tradition, an esoteric understanding of the human condition, and I think throughout history, we have these two streams, the esoteric, the inner heart of something, and then the exoteric, the outer visible side of it. And especially in the, let's say, the religious stream or the knowledge streams, the exoteric has been the dominant visible one. And it's also been the one that's kind of culturally survived in its form. And now, that's not necessarily a good thing either, because something that survived without change can become quite static. But let's say it's often managed to survive because it's also been embedded in the major exoteric religions, for example. So if you just take the three religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's been an esoteric side of those which have been recognized. For example, in Judaism, it's the Kabbalah. In Christianity, it's Gnosticism. And sometimes also before that, they refer to, or after that, Neoplatonism. And in Islam, it's being referred to as Sufism. So these are aspects of an esoteric inner tradition which have also survived in line with an exoteric platform. But besides that, there's always been this presence of these wisdom teachings, let's say, and not always visible. And just to finish this off, the people have generally referred to them as the philosophy, the perennial philosophy. Yet, of course, as we know, coming out of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and philosophy has been, very much tied with an intellectual path, a kind of, empirical, rational path as well. And the wisdom traditions have always talked a lot more about the human condition, almost as a kind of psychology, but there was never the modern language or vocabulary to frame it that way. And now that we, especially in the last half a century especially in the last century, since psychiatry and depth psychology, we've had the language. And I think the psychological aspect of the wisdom tradition perhaps is more suited in today's modern age rather than the philosophy side alone. So that's why I shifted the term from perennial philosophy to the psychology.
Okay. Do you think the psychology term is helpful in the sense that, you're making it clear that we should actually do something with perennial thought as opposed to just, theorize on it?
Yes, I mean, the whole point of a genuine wisdom tradition, let's say, is that it actually can be utilized. It's not just something that we theorize or we have blind faith and we follow it. Really, the genuine wisdom tradition has always been a human practical science, is that it's always been put to use. Otherwise, why would there be it? And it can actually work organically through a person and change them from the inside out, not just how you think. And also, what I come across is that the perennial path is not one that you just take on blind faith. Neither do you take on belief. I mean, you may need a belief as a vehicle to get you there. But once you get there, then you have to try to get away from belief, because belief is a structure which may help a person to achieve certain goals, but it's not a complete knowing. When if you put your hand in the fire, when it burn your hand, you don't say, I believe that fire is hot. You know the fire is hot. So there's a bridge between belief and knowing, which doesn't always get, let's say, scrutinized, really. And I think that if we can use vocabulary carefully, perennial path makes us realize that belief only takes a person so far. And after that has to be utilized. So through experiential knowing, a person comes to realize what it is or what it's not. James.
Huh. I said to you before this started that Gurdjieff will probably come into this. And already I'm seeing, the helpful language of Gurdjieff where he differentiates between knowing and understanding, in the sense that, knowing is what we get in school. We go through data, we just tick the boxes, we memorize the test. That's just knowledge. But there's a huge difference, as you're stating there, between the knowing that a fire is hot and putting your hand in the flame and understanding what it is to be burnt and understanding the actual process. Do you think, as a culture, we're sort of completely caught in the, the culture of knowledge and we no longer really understand, anything really?
Definitely so. Because, whether we like to accept it or not, that the majority of our cultural, let's say, framework, resides at a superficial level. And I think what is very dominant here is the understanding of what makes reality. Consensus reality is changed, through the ages, because it depends what the dominant narrative is. And the dominant narrative is one which people have generally taken on knowledge but not understanding, mainly because, of course, the major channels of knowledge are being centralized and controlled. So the information we get is we act on that. It takes a huge shift in that kind of communication. Is that similar to when we change from a flat Earth understanding to a round Earth, and also from a kind of Earth-centric center of the universe to a different one we have now. So knowledge is changing all the time according to what people are picking up and interpreting, whereas understanding is a much deeper depth, of course. Got my dog's barking there. Now the thing is, like, for example, you can be given knowledge of how to drive a car, but the question is, until you get in that car and start driving, you then pick up other kind of instinct of how to utilize the car. We have a kind of instinctual understanding of how to drive, but the question is, what are you going to use the car for? Knowledge of how driving a car is not going to be that valid unless you use the car for some purpose. So I think the utilization factor comes in, because when you understand something through experiential knowing, then it helps you to navigate what you wish to do better in your life. So I think the big bridge between knowledge and understanding is the utilization. Having knowledge of, let's say, the stars revolve in the sky, okay, but it goes beyond that, of course, to all the interconnectivity. So, I think most of the consensus reality doesn't get to a profundity of understanding, but stays with cultural knowledge and narratives.
Do you think that's where we sort of limit ourselves with our body and our minds? I know this is quite a big question, but obviously we tally up this knowledge of physiology, of biology, of chemistry, but we don't have an understanding really of how to use our body, how to utilize our minds and our body as much as we could. We no longer have that intuitive understanding of ourselves.
Sure, and if you go back to accounts of some of the, let's say, teachers or practitioners in the wisdom path, they've been often credited by what we would call doing miracles, and this often can be a negative factor. It kind of puts them on a kind of unearthly pedestal or of a kind of prophet pedestal. But there are abilities of the human body and its participation with the living cosmos that are obviously beyond the realm of a rational scientific paradigm. And really, a miracle, if you look at it, a miracle is just the let's say, the laws of another dimension operating in this dimension. In the past ages, certain technologies that we utilize today would be seen as miracles through previous generations. So it's just our cognitive level and our understanding is just at a completely different stage according to the full capacity of how we can use our minds and our bodies. And I think a lot of it is down to the fact that we have a very, the scientific revolution gave a kind of empirical way of researching phenomena, and it had to be proven, tested. And so, we probe and cut open the human body, and we try to find cures for our ills, but we don't fully understand the causes of our ills. And also, I think that a kind of, let's say, that the rational mindset has taken has a perspective which has a very kind of linear perspective rather than an integral whole. And that's becoming a bit of a cliche these days, because I know in the last 20 years, at least, last couple of decades, that the integral perspective is coming more to the fore, about time as well. But I think for far too long, the body and mind has been seen as separate. And also that comes in about consciousness. How we understand these terms, what is mind, what is body, what is consciousness, how we how we frame them, not understand them, how we frame them in our knowledge narratives, really then has a consequence of how we come to, approach them. So if you think that the body and the mind and consciousness are separate units, differentiated from, let's say, the environment around us, the energetic environment around us, or the cosmos around us, then of course we see ourselves as just biological units that can be, split apart. There's that famous tale of the boy who, wanted to see how the fly worked. So he dissected the fly and took off the wings, took off the legs, and then in the end he said, "Where's the fly gone?" We're dissecting these knowledge frameworks, and in the end we don't see anything as a whole. And I think that's the major problematique of our times, James.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's strange though, because your book is called the modern seeker, implying someone who's seeking this knowledge which we're talking about, or seeking entry into this. And one of the things that I think is quite poignant in a way for you to say is you state the doors of the sanctuary are open in every epoch. So, really, there is always this choice for people to become a seeker or to seek. I mean, maybe whether or not someone can become a seeker, that's a different question. But you state that the doors are always open to this perennial wisdom. Why do we? Maybe this is an obvious question, really, but why do we, as in every epoch, it seems that there's only a few who wish to truly venture inside? Most people are fine with the language and signs of the herd, really.
And that's always been the case. because life is all engulfing. Let's say the major narrative, and if we use a metaphor that let's say use metaphor of a game, then when you enter a game, you get taken up by the gameplay, and often certain narratives are already pre-programmed into the game, so you follow the script, so to speak. Now, of course, in the modern age, using that phrase loosely, we have both advantages and disadvantages. And I think the major disadvantage is that there's so much distraction in this age, in this era. And those distractions are pulling us out of ourselves, putting our perspective externally. And this comes from from day one, is that we are, in a sense, conditioned to entangle ourselves externally, whether it's on external support structures, external forms of obedience. We go to school, we have the whatever university or college, we have the job, we have those in society that we have to depend on. Everything is externally focused. And, in relatively recently, it's been full on, that we are so engaged in this external life of having to put our focus onto our career, our whatever personal life, and also our entertainment, because we often want to, want to have a rest, a break. And what do we do? Having a break means basically just focusing your neurons onto a different distraction, which, we may enjoy. We have to wonder why there's been such a increase in what we call extreme sports over recent times, because people want to really push themselves in different directions and to different extreme experiences to get away from this kind of pull of the drudgery of everyday life. But all this is still part of the game narrative. And what's let's say the part that is non-visible in these esoteric, that's always open, is that it's always there. It's not been hiding so much. It's just that people haven't either had the need to go for it, and that's another thing. Not everybody has the need to be a seeker, and that's fine. If you don't feel the need, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing to do about that. But some people who do feel a need to look for something different in life, they may go for another path. They may go for whatever religious or spiritual path. But the danger there is that these may also be part of the game, just another narrative, another path to take. And so, really, the reason why so few people actually get to the doorway is that because generally we have to go through a certain level of deconditioning before we can actually see there's a door there. It's a kind of a form of hypnotism. We can be hypnotized that there's no doors exist in the whole world. If you were hypnotized, James, by Darren Brown, and Darren Brown said, "You'll never see a door again in your life." You never see a door. You may bump into them, you may find ways of getting around them, but you won't see them. And I think that's part of the issue, is that we've just been hypnotized by the central focus of the gameplay of this consensus reality, that we just haven't seen what's always been there, but in a way that we don't expect it. And that's another thing. The perennial wisdom traditions have always said that, what you're looking for, don't look at it in the way that you want to find it, because it may be present in a way you're not expecting.
Do you think that this hypnotism, which you're talking about, this almost somnambulance of culture, do you think that what's causing that is doing so on purpose? Do you think there is sort of an agent there that is actually doing it, that has some potential, maybe even hostility or nonchalance towards humans? Or do you think that this is an unnaturally arising hypnotism which just bleeds out from culture generally?
I would say it's a mixture of both, although perhaps in recent times the nefarious side has probably increased its presence. Now, we've all traditions and spiritual and religious traditions have talked about that we are kind of disconnected from our origin. And this is nothing new. I mean, in the esoteric traditions, they talk about the fall, and a lot of people have the stories of how we've lost contact with our origin and with our homeland. So even the Greek myth about they say that when before a spirit is incarnated, it drinks from the river of forgetfulness. So we're told that when we arrive in this reality, we arrive kind of memory wiped, and so we have a forgetfulness, and we can try to remember throughout the life if we can. So there's a sense that when you enter this reality, naturally we have a disconnect, and maybe that's because it helps us to participate in this reality better, or maybe part of it is that so we can learn to regain ourselves in a way that we don't start by coming here exactly knowing where we came from. So there's that part. But of course, like anything, when you're in a game, there are players in the game who say, well, this is the game, I want to control it better, or let's take a general analogy. When you're at school and you're in the schoolyard and you're playing games with friends or whatever, maybe there's always certain groups who want to control the schoolyard games and be the boss. So taking that to a different level, I think there are players who have realized that there's a gameplay going on, and they would rather exploit that and take advantage of it. And if more people are unaware of that, the better. So if there's a few who understand some of the game rules, naturally to maintain their position, they want to make sure that the rest don't have a clue that there's any game rules whatsoever. And I think that's what's happening. And in recent times, that kind of control element, or what you may refer to as hostile forces, have kind of gained a greater control. So I think that's why times are more precarious, because not only do we have the original forgetfulness of which we arrived, we also have forces which are trying to maintain that state and even increase it against us. So I think, yes, these are more precarious times, James.
Do you think that that ability to remember yourself, that constant action to not be so forgetful, to remember and attune yourself to the actual real, do you think that's a test in some sense, and in that there will be a reward from that test?
No, I don't personally like to see it in those terms, because those terms, test and reward, to me just kind of smack of the consensus control programming. We go to school to be tested, and if we don't succeed, we feel like we've failed. That's a control mechanism, to succeed or fail. And also the reward, the carrot and the stick. These are mechanisms, to my understanding, that are part of, let's say, the control game of this reality. And if we are, and I do contend that we are, these spirits incarnating in this physical reality structure, then we can't fail in a sense. We can probably not get it in this reality, or not wake up to in this reality, but I wouldn't like to consider it as a test. I think there's a capacity to awaken and a capacity to accelerate our own individual evolution, and we get to that in our own pace. Everybody gets to it in their own rhythm. So there's not one kind of mold for everybody. So in that sense, we shouldn't consider it as a failure, but we should consider that do we find our own rhythm, and let's say, do we find our own ways of getting to where we need to be sooner or later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you say our own ways of getting to where we need to be, because this is something that, to bring it back in again, Gurdjieff actually emphasizes in that when they're on this sort of perennial path, when they're looking for truth, one should use the sort of the contexts and resources that are available to them in their specific, we could even say temporal or cultural context. And this is something that I've found, is that people who sort of venture too far, either back in time or too far sort of artificially to their personal context, it often taints whatever system they're trying to use. You often see this with Westerners who utilize Buddhism in some sense, and it often doesn't come across as it really should. At least this is my opinion. And I think this is something that Gurdjieff emphasizes, in that any system which makes you sort of hostile to your context at the moment, or hostile to the modern world, is a dangerous system, and it's not really correct. It should be one where you actually utilize what you're in to find a way out. And do you think there's an importance of sort of using the resources that you have as opposed to venturing too far back?
I would say what you just said there is actually, is core, is fundamental to a genuine path of wisdom. Because these genuine paths, what they've always stated is that a person must be completely adaptable and work within their own culture, because the genuine wisdom tradition adapts itself according to the time, the place, and the people. So that's why the exoteric religions are seen as being incompatible, because they haven't really changed. They've just stayed in the same kind of the same way. I mean, they've tweaked themselves, but they say this is the truth and this is for always. But of course, we understand things differently according to cultural context. People are, generationally, they change. They do change their perspectives, their perceptions, and so you cannot give one size fits all to a kind of path like this. And so, it's also often been said that if you want to dress like if you want to dress like a person from a different culture in your own culture, fine, but people look at you odd. The fact is, when people think about, let's say, developmental, transcendental traditions and teachings, they often think that a person or a practitioner or a seeker should be, someone who looks different, unusual. And that's why many people are attracted to these eccentric figures or guru figures, because actually what they're doing is just showing you what your own expectations. A person who really is going through a genuine path of development, you wouldn't spot them in the street. They're completely immersed with their environment, and they're of their time, they're of their place, and of course they use the tools of their time and place. So just as if we wouldn't use flint stones to make a fire today, would use a modern means. And so the same with any teaching tradition, that it would choose the tools, the methods, the vocabulary of the time and of the place. And I think that's what marks a difference between a kinetic living tradition and a static, crystallized, non-functional tradition, James.
Do you think, though, that the language that is used in certain contexts, in certain times, can still hamper that progression, even if they're working within the context? I think, Michel Serres calls it the empire of signs, and I wonder if this is something that is always there as a means to alter the way that we define and use and see certain things, and whether or not there's a way to actually get beyond this in all these different contexts that we might go through in life.
Well, signs, obviously, there's a famous phrase which says, 1,000 signs are not enough for the negligent. So if there's a sign, then obviously that kind of automatically symbolizes an exterior figure, an exterior connotation of something. A sign represents something else, doesn't it? That's what a sign means. It represents something else. It could be a logo sign. It could be a sign on a shop. It represents something else. And that's quite telling, because we have become, especially in the modern Western societies and cultures, a culture of signs. And in that way, it kind of also deflects us from going deeper. If we see a sign, we think, oh, yes, that represents so-and-so, and then you stop, And we are often navigated by signs. Now, let's say a teaching or a tool from the past in a tradition, it doesn't necessarily have to be redundant, because a genuine teaching contains the kernel which is always relevant. It's obviously how you can deliver it and how it's passed on. So, something from the past may have an external shallow symbol, but if you get past that, there is a kernel which could still be useful. So let's say several years ago, the best-selling poet in America was Rumi. And that was mainly because I think the author, or rather the transcriber, Coleman Barks, did a very good fluid translation of Rumi's poems. Now, Rumi, of course, from the 13th century, if you read him in the original, it would be very difficult because of that language is not generally used in the West now. But if you get a good interpreter who can present that, then people found great wisdom in Rumi, even though he's, so many centuries of the past. So there is worth in that, but we have to get past the superficial, and it has to be relevant for now. It may be functional, but the question is it relevant for now? And those are two different questions also.
How do you, perhaps even personally, how do you differentiate or almost intuit between, the genuine and the false or artificial wisdom? I think this is a tough one.
It is, and there's no kind of equation for it. You basically answered it in the question. It's intuition. And I'll quote Rumi, because he has a very good phrase here. He said, false gold exists because there's real gold, which means to say that, in all times, you'll have to contend with the counterfeit. And the counterfeit exists because, the real exists. And therefore, one is mimicry of the other. And so this is a personal response, because there's no way to frame this other than I would say that a person needs to go through a certain process of deconditioning first. We have to look at and consider what are our lens of interpretation. What are our perspectives? Now, if our perspectives are based on a certain cultural upbringing, are they social, economic, religious? Where do I gain my perspectives from? Are they influenced by certain ideologies and certain beliefs? We have to look at all these lenses of interpretation first, because then you can say, well, if I'm going to look at this information, if I look at it through lens A, B, and C, if I look at it through a social lens, religious lens, and a belief lens, am I going to get, what am I going to get? Am I going to get something which is related to my own kind of conditioning? So if you can then see that, you may be able to take away your layers of conditioning. And by taking away the layers of conditioning, you may be able to perceive something in its purer form. So any kind of element or aspect of true understanding or true truth is a matter of perceiving it. And really, I would say it's a process of taking away all the layers of filters and conditioning until you get to a level of your own instinctual nature. And that really just something you have to trust. I call it taste. When I come across something, I get a taste whether this is something genuine or has elements of something genuine, or is something artificial and construed and is part of the counterfeit culture. It's just taste. And again, another phrase that comes from the perennial wisdom tradition is that he who tastes knows.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting that you're talking about taste, because now my years of reading this stuff, of interviewing certain people, meeting certain people who are in occult or mystical traditions or philosophical traditions, I get a gut reaction to those that you were speaking about earlier, the eccentrics, those who are sort of attempting to create an image. I sort of have this instant feeling that there isn't really going to be anything there. And actually, this is something you write about in The Modern Seeker, and you state that this what I find in these people who are eccentric, who have these sort of large aesthetic egos and get-ups, is just this rebellion, which is almost like a teenage rebellion, which is and you write about this, and you say that actually rebellion just hampers any progress that we're making. Because is this because it's just it's another trick of the system? Yes,
in a way. I mean, often rebellion in this context we're talking about is is rebelling against the game. But by rebelling against the game, you're playing the game. Just look at some very kind of simple examples. Now, in let's say the modern music history, we've always thought the great rebellions are those people who trash the hotel rooms and throw the TVs out the windows and put their fingers up to the system. And you think, yeah, these are the rebels, and they get this bad press. But really, what they're doing is just selling more records. And the music industry knows this very well. I mean, why do they think they tolerate such kind of, such rebellious people? Because they don't care what they do. They don't care if they stick their fingers up to them, because they know they're selling more records and they profit. At the end, the industry profits. And so this is the same thing. It happens in all walks of life as well. Protest, has a certain function, but we can be, to fight the system head on and just headbang it. All you're doing is playing into the system, because the system will then say, okay, you're protesting. We need to therefore increase our defense or our laws against you protesting. It's a very similar way. It's as if we're not really understanding the game rules. We're just playing into it and being kind of, I suppose, used as well. So yes, I do feel that a rebellion in this way is often, we think, or people may think, that they're, getting one over on the system, etc., and they're allowed to get away with it because, they're playing into the system. For example, if a rebel guru, eccentric guru, attracts lots of followers, then the system's happy because it's just another distraction, and people think that they're having they've found a path for them, and so they continue with their lives. Rather than trying to really find what is the escape path, what is the real door. So yes, it all just plays into the system. That's very confusing for what always has been confusing, but that's part of the understanding to arrive at.
Do you think there's a different type of rebellion then? You seem to sort of be leading towards that there was a couple of types of rebellion there.
Well, I would say one response would be, there's a quite a well-known phrase from the architect Buckminster Fuller. I've used it in other contexts, social contexts. I think it also applies to this esoteric context. And Buckminster Fuller said, which you may know the phrase, you never change the existing system by fighting head-on. To change the incumbent system, you create a new system to take its place. So what this implies is that I think a person has to not try to, there's a rebellion against the system. There's another rebellion, which is finding your own reality. And also, in a way, finding a way around that. We have to live in this world. Of course, we've chosen, or we have arrived in this reality. We have to play it. We have to play it also with knowing different game rules. So I think the rebellion is actually not reading the given instruction manual, but trying to find the rules which are outside of the system. And that could be a form of rebellion, but in a very kind of subtle way, in a conscious way, not in a flamboyant look at me type of way. I think the real rebellion is a quiet, silent, internal rebellion that nobody will actually notice, and before it's too late, as they say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is this why you sort of make it clear that this perennial path is really for those who already lead stable lives? Because if you're in an unstable state and you're being, pulled to and fro, maybe by, I think you do find a lot of this in these small cultures of, occultism, mysticism, of, people who might have addictions, or people who are just get pulled back and forth between every other system that they find. And there seems to be something very almost counterintuitive to that, to say, well, actually, you need to have a stable life. I mean, you need to know what reality, you need to know what the non-reality is before you can begin to actually explore it. If you're already lost, then you need to work on that before starting anything else. Would I be on the right lines there?
You're spot on. And that's because a lot of times these let's say spiritual paths, or these other forms of transcendental groupings, you talked about occultism, mysticism, people have used them as a kind of crutch to stabilize themselves. Often I mean, it's no surprise that, mystical and especially occult paths have in the past attracted very unstable characters, because and occultism is kind of well known for attracting, the rebellious people, the people who want to, stick their fingers up to the system. I mean, of course, that's not taking anything away from the genuine occultism. There's many genuine practitioners, but of course, and obviously, mysticism has attracted weirdos in that kind of that very general sense. It's people who need or are wishing to find something, often to validate themselves. They feel that they can't fit into society. They feel that they're owed something, or also some people want to get revenge on the system, whatever that means or entails. And some people have, let's say, I have to be honest with you, some people have personality disorders, let's say. There's a whole range and gamut of different people in different states, but generally, it has been known that these traditions have attracted people who need a crutch to help them feel, like I say, gain stability, or often to gain attention as well to themselves. Which is why, there's been many examples of teachers or guides who just, blank their students because they want to get them, weaned off attention seeking. So if a person first can't find stability within themselves, then yes, if they come with some level of instability, then they'll come with a lot of other things as well. Certain things like expectations, attention seeking, an unstable attitude towards their peers and people around them. But the whole point of a genuine path is a person has to fit in to their social milieu and fit into their surroundings in a way that doesn't draw attention to them. So if a person is trying to find a path, to make them stand out, to make them look like they're different, and they say, yes, look, I'm different, that's the very opposite of what a genuine path is trying to develop, James.
So it seems sort of completely counterintuitive to the common idea of what it is to be a seeker. Really, a seeker is actually someone you should never really see. Would you?
Yes, exactly put. Yeah, I think you put it very well, and to put it in a very succinct phrase, a genuine seeker is one that you would never spot or recognize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One sort of question I have, because I know I think we both have this interest here of George Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way, and also the sort of the offshoot of this school, Ouspensky, and I've started to read Bennett since you recommended him, and probably will move from that into Sufi stuff because that was Bennett's interest. And when I was reading your book, there is some references to Gurdjieff in there, and because Gurdjieff, I think, is working with the perennial wisdom, to clearly come up. But, would you agree that he really is, or the Fourth Way really is, sort of one of the most recent, at least well-known attempts at a perennialism?
Yes and no. Again, it depends how you frame the term recent, because obviously the perennial tradition is such a long historical path. Recent could be centuries. So we know, of course, Gurdjieff. Now, around the turn of the centuries, there was a huge interest in these different traditions. Of course, there was Theosophy with Blavatsky. There was before that, the rise in spiritualism. After that, there was Steiner as well. So it was a kind of age where a lot of interest was burgeoning. And what Gurdjieff did, of course, was he physically went to the East and traveled most of his life to seek some of the origins of these teachings. And he wanted to bring them back to a Western context. And that for me is a very powerful element in the Gurdjieff's Fourth Way, is that he took them out of, he went to seek these teachings from their origins, but his intention was to interpret them for a Western audience, which is why he used scientific and psychological framework and terminology. So in that sense, I think he did a great service in bringing over a realm of information that did actually pique a lot of people's interest. But of course, no, I wouldn't say he was the most recent, because Gurdjieff was a very visible character to say the least. And as I said, around that time, from the end of the 19th century until like the middle of the 20th century, there were some very visible characters. But after Gurdjieff, you mentioned Bennett, and Bennett, the history of Bennett is well known in these circles, and I think he talks about it very much in his autobiography. He says that obviously when Gurdjieff passed on, and then of course Uspensky and Gurdjieff passed on within a couple of years of each other, he was looking for the next person in the lineage. And the history, if you follow it, is that he came across this person who came in the lineage of Sufism. His name was Idris Shah. And Bennett was convinced after meeting Shah on several occasions that he also represented this lineage, but was presenting it within the framework of Sufism, but in a Western psychological framework of Sufism, rather than a kind of the past Islamic form of Sufism. And when Bennett came convinced of this, he just basically gave his whole school, his buildings, over to Shah, which was a great sacrifice to give away your whole, meeting center and school and everything. You passed on to Shah. So I would say in that respect, Shah is more recent than Gurdjieff and does follow that lineage.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about the modern seeker, which I might have glossed over? Or obviously there's going to be a lot, but is there anything key that you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, we covered a lot. I'd probably like to talk about technology, because it's hard to have a discussion on the modern age without understanding technology. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I wasn't sure whether I wanted to frame it as, the seeker, because obviously the seeker has so many connotations, the spiritual seeker, etc., etc. But I wanted to try to get across the impression that the seeking or the path to true understanding does exist, and therefore it exists in the modern time. But in the modern time, we're surrounded by technology, and for some people, there's a sense that technology and the path to advanced technology and AI, kind of, for some people, kind of takes away the let's say the functionality or the need for a kind of inner path. And I would say, that this technological age, on the contrary, necessitates more focus on the inner understanding, because technology is an external manifestation of the human state. It's something it's an interface which humanity utilizes. But that interface has developed so quick in the past few decades in a way that I would feel that the inner state or the inner perceptual level of humankind is having a kind of dissonance with this. And I think that's creating some of the unbalance, is that technology and technologists are racing ahead, but there's been a lack of attention onto the necessity of the human inner state. Because if we're not careful, we will be too immature and not perceptive enough to understand where technology is taking us, because we haven't also, accelerated our development either. Technology can give us access to great communication, great information. And in fact, a person can find a lot of the tools needed today by searching online. Now, in the past, a lot of this information was only available by finding a local community, let's say a teacher, going through a process of initiation. But in the recent years, so much information and knowledge, which leads to understanding, has been made available in ways we wouldn't expect, because I think there's a need now for people to reach to it. So technology is a tool that enables us to also do our own research, enable us to interface with the world, around the world, and to connect, just as we're doing. And it's in no way incompatible with seeking a path of internal development. On the contrary, it can be one of the major tools. We have to realize that it's our state which allows us to utilize our external tools, James.
So it's sort of a case of using our will to once again not get caught up in some sort of artificially created addictive mechanism, which seem to be a bit more rampant in technology, especially within smartphones and social media. But I don't think these actually really differ too much from, the past technologies that we've had. It's just once again a case of utilizing one's will and overcoming that.
Yeah, exactly. So the external world is let's say, I use that word loosely, projection, but it's interrelated with our internal world. The two go together. Often that's why we see so much issues in the world at the moment. It's almost as if our unconscious projections are being played out in the world. So these external, let's say, the external objects, tools, technology, these are all elements that we can use for our own seeking, our own internal development. They are a part of us. We should not see them as being separate. That, again, is going back to the earlier narrative of the kind of materialistic narrative that we are independent, standalone physical bodies and the world around us are separate. No, we are interrelated to the finest degree. And so, therefore, we should use external tools for internal necessities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. It seems to be a good place to sort of finish up, unless there's anything you'd like to add. Whereabouts can we purchase The Modern Seeker?
Well, The Modern Seeker, I published this through my own imprint, rather than going through a traditional publisher. So it's a book which is print on demand, so it's available online. So if you do online search for the usual places to find it, you can find it. And I would just like to add that everything I put in the book and everything we talked about today is only coming from my personal perspective. And I would encourage others to go out and find their personal perspective and to understand through their own experience. Don't take what I've said as being gospel. It is not. It's just my understanding. I encourage other people to find their own and go their own way.
Okay. Kingsley Dennis, thanks very much.